Welcome to Thriller Recaps. Today, I am explaining the movie, Family Plan, explaining every scene as it happens. Watch till the end, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this. Dan Morgan came home to find his wife, Jessica, and their daughter, Nina, arguing on their anniversary. He gifted Jessica flowers to mark the occasion. As his son, Kyle, was on his way out, Dan told him that he needed to babysit his younger brother, Max, as it was their anniversary. Kyle replied that he was going to his friend Samir's place. Dan then asked Nina to babysit Max instead. Kyle, meanwhile, went to Samir's house to play video games. Dan and Jessica went to the amusement park, and after their ride, Dan promised to take her somewhere different next year. However, they soon encountered trouble. A guy who was there with his friends had taken a picture of Dan kissing Jessica. Dan asked him to delete the picture, but the guy refused and posted it online. When Dan insisted, the guy poured his drink on Dan to push him. Dan fixed him with a death stare but then walked away. Back home, Jessica told Dan to ignore what those guys had said. The next morning, Jessica met her friend Gwen at the gym. Gwen, who was in the travel business, told Jessica that she was there to meet her ex. Later, Jessica and Gwen had drinks together and talked about family. She confessed that she felt trapped in their small town and wished they could travel, but her husband was content staying put. Meanwhile, Dan had Max strapped to him while shopping at the supermarket. He noticed a man following him, and soon a fight broke out. The man, an assassin, tried to kill Dan, even with the baby on him. After a struggle, Dan managed to knock the assassin unconscious. He drove home, retrieved his hidden stash of cash, and realized his passport had expired. He called his old friend Augie from his past life to help him get a new one, and they planned to meet in Vegas. Augie asked if Dan had told his family yet, and Dan replied that he would do so soon, knowing it wouldn't be easy. Dan packed some essentials from home and went to Nina's and Kyle's school to pick them up. They then picked up Jessica from her job as a physiotherapist. Sensing they were being trailed, Dan convinced Jessica to go on a road trip to Texas. Although she found it quite spontaneous, she agreed. Jessica asked about their belongings, and Dan told her he had packed the basics. He reassured her that they could get anything else they needed once they arrived, which excited her even more. As they drove, Dan tried to evade the assassins trailing them without alerting his family. He told them they were taking shortcuts, but the assassins always found them. Realizing there had to be a tracker on the vehicle, Dan drove to his workplace at a car dealership. In the service area, Dan jacked up the car just enough so it wouldn't be visible when the assassins drove by, though the tracker suggested he was there. Dan then discreetly approached his colleague Hal and fixed the tracker on Hal's fast car. He encouraged Hal to drive fast, promising to pay for any ticket if he was stopped by the police. Hal agreed, successfully deceiving the assassins into following him. Thinking it was Dan got back on the road with his family, who remained unaware of the danger. When Jessica took pictures she wanted to post on social media about their vacation, before she did, Dan immediately asked everyone to give up their phones and threw them away off a bridge, including his own, shocking his family. The man after Dan, McCaffrey, arrived at Dan's house and ordered more men to be sent after Dan. One of his men checked the family's social media and noticed there hadn't been any recent posts. In the new place, while Kyle and Nina discussed his obsession with video games, a girl approached them, claiming to be a fan of Kyle, and begged to take pictures with them. Dan was in the restroom, practicing how to tell Jessica about his past life as an assassin, so he did not notice this. Just after booking 2 rooms at the motel for his family, he saw Kyle taking pictures with a girl who repeatedly called him Killboy, his gamer tag. Dan asked if the girl was going to post the picture she had taken, and Kyle answered that she might. When Jessica asked about the rooms, Dan lied, saying there were no rooms available and they had to leave. While Dan was driving, his family members were all asleep except for Max. He noticed some men overhead and got his gun ready. He blocked Jessica's ear with a headphone, as the older kids already had on their earpieces. He was being chased by men on bikes, and gunshots were exchanged. Dan managed to lose all of them, sending the bikers flying, while Max laughed gleefully. Jessica woke up just after one of the men had gone flying into a billboard. Dan drove them to Iowa, where Nina's boyfriend Trevor attended college and where Nina wanted to go, though her mom was not supportive. Despite her mom's disagreement, they went to visit the school for a tour. During the tour, Dan mistook a German man, who was also there with his daughter, for an assassin. Jessica stumbled upon them and heard Dan speaking to the man in German, which she never knew he could speak. Dan was attacked by someone else but, without alerting his family, managed to subdue the assassin in the school's chemistry lab after a struggle. Meanwhile, Nina found out that Trevor was cheating on her. She returned to the car very sad, so Dan taught her a technique to inflict a lot of pain on Trevor without causing major damage, so he would learn a lesson. Nina went back to Trevor's room and implemented what her dad had taught her, leaving Trevor on the floor in pain. At their motel, things got intimate between Jessica and Dan. She told him how things felt different from before, saying it felt like she was cheating on him with some other version of Dan. Jessica told Dan that he had become the man she first met. She asked if she was the reason he had changed, and he replied that he didn't like who he was back then, which was why he had changed. Dan called Augie to remind him about their meeting and the new passport. Augie asked if he had told his family yet about his former life, but Dan had not. Augie then asked how he was going to explain their new names on the passports if he didn't tell them now. Dan reassured him that he would explain it to them soon. Kyle stumbled on his dad practicing what he would tell his wife, and he wondered what he was talking about. Instead of asking, he challenged his dad to a game. If Kyle won the game, he could continue to be a gamer. But if Dan won, Kyle would play catch with him for the next 6 months. They played the game, and Dan won, surprising and angering Kyle. Dan told him he did well and that he enjoyed playing the game with him. They hugged it out and joined the others. They made it to Texas and were given a magnificent suite that they all loved. Dan and Jessica planned a dinner for two. Dan went down to the casino to meet Augie, who gave him the passports. He handed Augie a bag full of money. Augie told him he had booked a flight for Dan and his family for the morning and asked if he had told Jessica yet. Dan said he would do so at dinner. Back at the suite, Dan and Jessica got ready for their date. They instructed Kyle and Nina not to leave the suite, and not to open the door for anyone. However, as soon as their parents left, they also left with Max. Dan and Jessica were spotted by an assassin. Meanwhile, Kyle made Nina go with him to a HyperX event for gamers where they met Ren, one of the top gamers, who recognized Kyle as Kill. Ren offered to introduce him to another top gamer, Valkyrae, which excited Kyle. At the restaurant, Dan tried to tell Jessica about his secret, but they were interrupted by the waiter, who spoke to them in French. Dan replied, shocking Jessica because she had no idea he spoke French, and she found this sexy. She told him they would talk later about why he never told her he could speak different languages, and why he had been acting strange enough to decide to go to Texas so suddenly. In the gaming event, Kyle met Valkyrae and joined his team to play against another team, while Ren talked to Nina. Meanwhile, the kids were being watched. Dan decided to call to check on the kids, but there was no answer. They headed back, only to see what appeared to be the kids' sleep. Jessica went into their room to freshen up and set the mood for intimacy, but then she heard gunshots outside the room. Dan killed 2 assassins who took shots at him. Another assassin, Coogan, held Jessica hostage, telling Dan, whom he called Sean, that he would kill him, then her, and then his people at HyperX would kill the kids. Dan dropped his gun but took a hidden knife and threw it into Coogan's eye socket, killing him. Jessica freaked out and vomited. She ran to check on the kids, only to find them gone. Jessica and Dan rushed to HyperX to find them. She yelled at him, telling him not to talk to her on the way and blaming him for the kids not having their phones because he had thrown them away. Kyle helped his team when just as Dan and Jessica arrived. Dan told them they had to get out of the city, but the kids thought he was overreacting. He explained that his former colleagues were after him and revealed that he used to be a government assassin. His kids laughed until a shot was fired from behind them. Dan helped them hide while he went after the assassin. He shot the female assassin, but it didn't penetrate her bulletproof vest. She came after them again, but this time, Dan shot her in the head, killing her. Kyle barfed at the sight. The family made their way into the crowd, causing another assassin to miss them. At a motel, Dan told his family everything, including his real name, Sean. He explained about McCaffrey, who had trained him to be an assassin. Dan was sent on missions to kill bad people, but McCaffrey became greedy and started using the assassins for hire, which was why Dan left. They'd been after him ever since. His family realized this was why he was against social media and traveling. He didn't want to be found. He gave them each a passport with new identities, which upset them. The kids gave the passports back to him. Jessica was very disappointed because he hadn't trusted her after 18 years of marriage, but he explained that he was still the same person and that he loved. She told him she would take the children and leave because they weren't safe with him. Jessica used Gwen's card to call her for help with traveling in the morning and refused to tell Dan where they were headed even when their taxi came. He yelled that it wasn't safe, and she replied that he should make it safe and then stay away from them. The taxi drove Jessica and the kids to a private plane. They were confused until Gwen came out of the plane. Gwen told Jessica that she was close by, so she decided to pick them up herself. She offered the kids food on the plane and asked Jessica about her husband. Jessica replied that they had fought. Gwen told a story about her ex dumping her for someone lesser, which sounded oddly like she was referring to Jessica. But Jessica understood and tried to make an excuse to leave the plane, but they weren't allowed to because a scary-looking man appeared. The man told Gwen that he had instructed her not to get involved. Gwen replied that she had been able to bring Dan's family to him. She told the man to do whatever he wanted with them, but she wanted Dan as payment. Sean got a call from McCaffrey, who told him that he had his family and that he should meet him in an abandoned casino, which he did. He was met by Spiro, who took him up an elevator to meet McCaffrey. Jessica and the kids realized that McCaffrey was Dan's father. McCaffrey told Dan that he wanted him back, but Dan said he wasn't interested in that life anymore. McCaffrey offered to let his family go back to their lives safely if Dan worked for him with no contact with his family. Dan refused. This made McCaffrey angry, so he ordered Gwen to shoot Jessica. Dan then agreed. Spiro was instructed to take them to the airport. As Jessica and the kids were being taken away, Nina told Jessica that they shouldn't abandon Dan. Jessica said there was nothing she could do because she had to protect them. Kyle joined Nina in talking about their dad. They got into an elevator and discussed their plan in front of Spiro. Suddenly, Jessica decided to change Max's diaper. She used the diaper to cover Spiro's face, causing him to fall off a banister. She picked up Spiro's gun, and they headed back up to help Dan. They found Gwen sitting on Dan, but he knocked her out. They tied up the tech guy. Dan apologized to Jessica, swearing never to lie to her again. Meanwhile, McCaffrey, who was downstairs, couldn't find Spiro. They saw McCaffrey making his way back into the building through the drone's camera. Dan told them to head to the roof to hide, saying he had to end this because it was the only way they could go home. Kyle pointed out that there were many men, but Dan replied that they didn't have what he had. He gave Kyle a comm so he could report what was happening, being his eyes and ears through the drone, then he left. They found a bag with explosives inside, which eventually blew some men away. Dan shot at a man on top, throwing him down, which gave away his position. Kyle helped him locate McCaffrey's men around him till he got to his father and pointed a gun at him after killing many of his men, telling him to stand down. But McCaffrey sent more men to shoot at him. McCaffrey noticed that the drone was not being controlled by the tech guy, so he called out Gwen's name through a comm, telling her to look for Kyle. Gwen took the elevator up. Jessica and the kids noticed someone coming up to the roof, so she helped them hide under a platform while she pointed the gun at the elevator door. She started shooting once the elevator door opened, but Gwen had moved away from the middle of the elevator, so she didn't get shot. Jessica tried to fight Gwen, but she couldn't land many hits on her because she was a professional assassin. Gwen teased her for her fighting skills. When she caught Jessica looking at where she had hidden the kids, she went after them. Jessica pushed through, even though she was getting beaten. Kyle kept telling Dan who was coming close while they tried to move away from their hideout. Jessica and Gwen continued fighting. Nina dropped Max off with Kyle so she could help their mom. While Kyle was giving Dan the whereabouts of McCaffrey's men, McCaffrey shot down the drone, making Kyle lose visuals. Gwen hit Jessica, causing her to fall onto some metal, which then tumbled down onto her. Gwen then tried to go after Kyle, who was holding Max. Nina pushed a trolley at Gwen, almost making her fall off the building, but Gwen managed to stay on. McCaffrey, now the only man still alive, shot at Dan and hit him, making him fall. He told Dan that he no longer had any use for him because his family had weakened him. Gwen tried to go after the kids, so Jessica, who had a large block of concrete on her, pushed it off and ran at Gwen. However, Gwen threw Jessica down to another level of the rooftop. Dan and his father continued fighting. Jessica, who had fallen onto some bamboo sticks, tried to flip over with them since she had been a decathlete. But the bamboo broke, sending her crashing face first. Gwen took advantage of this, throwing jabs at Jessica. Jessica picked up a shorter stick and threw it at Gwen, hitting her straight in the chest. Dan and his dad were still fighting, but McCaffrey gained the upper hand by picking up his gun. As McCaffrey was about to shoot Dan, Jessica and the kids rushed him. Nina started talking about family, and how they had become a family to distract him. It worked, allowing Dan to knock McCaffrey out. The police arrived soon after. 6 months later, Nina was mentioned on the news for exposing McCaffrey's operation. Dan opened a new security business, while Jessica became a coach at a high school. The family went on another road trip together. Dan pretended to throw their phones out of the car again, which had them screaming.